Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first citywide virtual New York City Racial Justice Commission public input session. In order to connect with New Yorkers in as many ways as possible, we are hosting a virtual public input session. I am Joanne Yu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. My pronouns are she, hers. I have been appointed to serve as one of 11 commissioners on the Racial Justice Commission and stand before you today in that capacity. I also want to introduce the other commissioners present today. Commissioners, if you can introduce yourselves and state your pronouns.
Henry Garrigo, I'm the Vice Chair. I'm also the Executive Director, District Council 37 in New York City.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Daniel Favors. Pronouns are she, hers, and I am the Interim Executive Director and General Counsel at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, New York.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yesenia Mata. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am the Executive Director of La Colmena based in Staten Island.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fred Davey. I am I'm a commissioner from Long Island City and Queens. I serve as the Senior Strategic Advisor to the President at Union Theological Seminary. I also chair the city's Civilian Complaint Review Board, and I'm actually sitting in an airport, which is why I'm covered in a mask as we do these introductions. Thank you.
Greetings all, my name is Kay Bain. I'm the founder, executive director of Community Capacity Development. Pleasure to see you all this evening.
Chris, you're on mute.
Sorry, this is Chris Coy. I'm the former executive director of Asian Americans for Equality, retired.
Great. Thank you, commissioners. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the history of the land in which we convene on tonight. Although we are not in person, most of us are tuning in, are sitting on the land of Native people indigenous to this country and the traditional home of the Munsee Lenape, Rockaway, Canarsie, and Wappinger people. Thank you all for attending today's session to tell us what you believe are the most critical issues we, the commission, should address through changes in the New York City Charter that would have the greatest impact on the lives of New Yorkers impacted by racism across the city. Before we begin, if anyone needs interpretation, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and locate the globe icon. Select the icon and the available language, which should be Spanish. Staff, we're good? Okay. What is the Racial Justice Commission? Our commission is tasked with proposing changes to the city's charter that will uproot structural racism. We will lay the groundwork for a racially equitable city where race is not a determinant of economic, political, social, or psychological outcomes. New York City voters will be able to vote on the commission's proposal as balloted measures in the November 2022 elections. The commission is composed of 11 members, and we are intentionally bringing together smaller groups of commissioners to host each public input session. As you know, the charter is the constitution of our city, the foundation of our government. The charter determines the role and responsibilities of city agencies and other local elected officials. The commission is empowered to propose changes to the city charter, which must be approved by New York City voters. Through charter revision, the commission can propose direct changes that will affect you, your family, neighborhood, and communities, such as how city government spends money and makes decisions. It can change government in all aspects of life, including health, education, housing, economic development, economic opportunities, policing. It can create or change agencies or the power of officials.
Our statement of purpose is the commission values your expertise as engaged residents of New York City. Every voice matters. You have firsthand experience on the ways in which city government impacts your day-to-day life, from sanitation, garbage pickup, to housing security and affordability, zoning, parks, small businesses, public safety, and so much more. Today, we are here to listen to you, to hear what critical issues most impact your ability to feel empowered, gain access to resources and services, and have opportunities to live a thriving, healthy, and safe life in your respective communities. We need your help identifying the barriers to achieving racial justice. We need you to bring to the Commission's attention ways the government acts unfairly that we may not know about. Your collective input will help us identify patterns that point to larger structural issues within the city. Your input helps us to know what issues are most important and most pressing to everyday New Yorkers. Every testimony will be kept in city record, and the highlighted issues will shape what the commission creates as ballot measures. Your input will quite literally shape recommendations for ballot measures in the November 2022 election.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to share with you all a bit of the overview information that you will need in order to fully participate in this session. Today, we're going to be hosting this session a bit differently than we have done our in-person public hearings for those of you who were able to attend or watch those on stream. And we want to take the necessary steps to attempt to restore the balance of power to the community. And to that end, we've incorporated restorative justice techniques into this session. All speakers will be joining us as panelists when you give your testimony. And we acknowledge that many of the folks in this Zoom have already been fighting for racial justice, literally while enduring the very inequities that you are fighting against. We get it. Many of us have those similar experiences. And we will start this session first with an acknowledgement of the harm that racism and institutionalized white supremacy has caused Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. We'll then review some group agreements to set the foundation for the session tonight, at which point we'll move forward with the community testimony. If you have not already signed up and you are interested in testifying publicly today, please send an email to racialjustice@charter.nyc.gov. That's racialjustice@charter.nyc.gov. Each person testifying will receive 3 minutes. That's 3 real minutes in real life. There will be a stop clock on the screen that will help guide you so that you stay on time, and you'll be notified by a sound when you have 30 seconds left to speak. We ask that you do please respect the time. And please also know that commissioners may ask follow-up questions. For those of you who are testifying, your answers to those follow-up questions will not be timed, but we do ask that because of the number of folks who will be speaking tonight, that you do keep your responses brief. We'll be calling the speakers in the order in which they registered, and you'll be called to testify one person at a time. Again, after you testify, commission members may have questions for you. So please keep your camera on and stay attentive after you speak. I cannot stress this enough. These questions are vital. And I want to spend a little bit of time here just to make sure that we're all on the same page about this. This entire session, these hearings are really for us as commissioners and the staff for this body to hear from you, to learn from you what is happening, to learn what your experiences as activists or folks who are experiencing the impact of racism, your solutions, your ideas, your concepts. When we are asking questions, it is not an effort to shift the burden of labor. It is not to ask you to take on uncompensated labor in an effort to help make our lives easier. It really is to find out more information about the issues you are testifying about so that we are better able to ensure that whatever solutions come out of this body are actually going to be more specifically tailored to the structural inequities that exist that produce the realities that you're going to be speaking about. I just want us to be really clear about that, because unfortunately, we know that in the balance of power, there is often an expectation that the least empowered communities solve the problems without access to the resources. This session is not about that. This session is about us hearing from you directly so that we're clear about whatever structural changes can be made through the charter to eliminate or ameliorate the institutionalization of white supremacy and racism in our city are as effectively handled as possible. After the Q&A, the current speaker will be moved back into the audience and we will call the next person up to testify, at which point you will be moved in as a panelist. This may take a couple of times to get, but we have some really awesome staff here. They're going to help guide us through this process. So we do ask that you're all patient with us. Please note, tonight we also have mental health support staff who are trained to provide emotional support when necessary. If you're having a difficult time emotionally with anything said in this meeting, please feel free to send an email to racialjustice@charter.nyc.gov. Once again, that's racialjustice@charter.nyc.gov, and we'll connect you to the trained mental health responders. Finally, just want to leave with a statement of the recognition of the harm. And this will really pick up on some of the things that I mentioned just a moment ago. We're also really here to acknowledge what a lot of us already know. Then that is that racial inequities are baked into the very foundations of this city. And that is a recognition that deep-seated structural inequities continue to be reflected in virtually every aspect of our lives, whether it's health, education, public safety, so on and so forth. And more importantly, for many of us, how our communities are resourced or not. Many of you in this Zoom have already borne the brunt of this reality for far too long. And through the Racial Justice Commission, we have an opportunity to start, and I emphasize start, to address and rectify the harms of the past through structural change to city government and how it functions to adequately and equitably serve all New Yorkers, no matter their race or zip code. I emphasize again, this is a start. This is a process that requires our communities to show up and show out in ways that we certainly know that we can. And we are hopeful that this process and these hearings will give us that much more insight so that we are able to more effectively ensure that New York City really is equitably representative for all of us. Thank you.
So over the last several public sessions we've hosted, we have worked to create group agreements because we know how important group agreements are to ensure that we respect all participants who take part of these sessions. I am going to ask the staff to post the group agreements on the screen so everyone can read them. I will be reading them out loud, but please follow as I indicated. It's really important for us to say that we are in agreement with these agreements so we could have a good session and we could hear everyone. The first is to have respect for ourselves for showing up and participating and doing the work of seeking racial justice. A big round of applause to you all for everyone who's taking or has taken part of these sessions. Number two, respect for the virtual space that we occupy. Number three, respect for each other's right to speak. That is one mic. We will mute ourselves when we are not speaking. We will not cheer, boo, or speak while someone is testifying. Number four, respect for each other's time. We will respect the 3-minute time limit. And just keeping in mind, love, honesty, and transparency. We are all here because we believe in this mission. We want to make sure that New York City becomes as inclusive as it can be. And everyone's time here is precious. And thank you for everyone that has participated and is participating. And now I will hand it over to Commissioner Joanne Jo.
Thank you. So we will now begin our community testimony. We will move the following 4 people to panelists, and you will come into the Zoom in order in which you are called. When you speak, please keep in mind the interpreters need you to speak slowly. As a reminder, this is being live streamed to the public. If you prefer to submit written testimony and would like to, please do so by visiting our website to submit online at nyc.gov/racialjustice. Click on the public engagement tab and click submit your input. So let me, first 4 people: Jennifer Rios, Tanya Bonner, Deneen Ferguson, and Taisha Capers. Jennifer, we will start with you. Did we lose Jennifer?
So like Jennifer is currently not here right now.
Okay, so let's move on to Tanya Bonner. We can put Jennifer back on the list when she comes back on. So Tanya Bonner. Oh, I think they're all logging in. So right now we're going to go to the person who is here, M. Denise Pollard. Ms. Pollard? If you can unmute yourself and start your testimony. Just
Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through some technical challenges. We're checking to see if Denise Pollard is having some issues with the mute unmute. So just hang tight for a second. Thank you so much. I just want to make an announcement to anybody who is listening in on the Zoom, on the YouTube. If you are on the YouTube and you've signed up to testify, we will need you to come over to the Zoom link in order to testify. We have a number of people signed up whose names we do not see in the Zoom attendee list. So please come over to the Zoom if you've signed up to testify, or if you have not signed up, but you would like to testify. We have one attendee who is ready to testify, Michelle Napoleon.
okay, Michelle. Ms. Napoleon, we can start with you. If you can unmute yourself, or if the staff can unmute her, we can get started. Thanks everybody for sticking with us. As great as technology is, sometimes we do have these little glitches, and this is our first virtual session. So we need to work out the kinks before the next one. So please stick with us, and we will get started unmuting the mics as soon as we can. Thanks.
Speakers should be able to unmute yourselves. Michelle, I'm not able if you're, oh, I see that Michelle is elected not to testify. Okay, thank you.
All right, we will go to the next next person. Aisha Torres is next. Ms. Torres, if you can unmute yourself and start us off.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know if you can see me though.
Now, nope, you're gonna have to turn your camera on.
Just give me a minute.
Okay.
I just want to, since you're doing this, good evening, good afternoon, because I don't even know what time it is. Just basically, my name is Aisha Torres, and I'm the president of the Resident Association of Alfred E. Smith Houses, which is part of NYCHA. We're one of 300 and something developments. And while you're doing this charter, one of the things that needs to happen is that we need to be included when things are being done in the URLA process. We are totally excluded the same way when we submit calls to 311, they refer us to NYCHA. So there is actually no control, no oversight. And I think that is an injustice to every resident who lives in public housing. People seem to forget that we pay taxes, we're citizens. Some of the best citizens of this country have come out of public housing, especially New York City. And so I would hope that when you make your recommendations, that is one of them, that we are included and not excluded and treated like second-class citizens as we have for the last 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please stick around in case the commissioners have any follow-up questions.
Can I ask a question of the person who just testified?
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, Aisha, how are you?
I'm fine, Henry. How are you?
I'm good. Just good to hear from you.
Same here.
At a previous hearing, one of the presenters has suggested an idea that I would love to hear from you about, because we've debated it previously, where he suggested that one of the charter consideration ought to be to turn NYCHA into a city agency. We debated this over the fact that NYCHA receives a lot of money from the federal government. But at the same time, as you had indicated, we've heard testimony from people indicating that NYCHA is treated differently in a way that it addresses structural challenges, governance, a number of things. You mentioned some of them. Do you believe that the proposal previously presented to the commission in consideration to make the New York City Housing Authority a city agency, notwithstanding what legal provisions we would have to, or challenges we would have to, would be a positive thing for the residents of NYCHA?
That's not a conversation I've had. But what I do know is that part of the issues and the problems that we have in NYCHA is that it is totally outsiders, outside of public housing residents who are running NYCHA. People make all kinds of decisions and have all kinds of theories, and no one sits us at the table to ask us exactly what we would like to see, where we would like our governance to go. I don't know if I answered your question, but
So the challenge of what you mentioned regarding 311 and not being at the table for ULURP is part of where the structural challenges that we have in the commission. We can only address through the City Charter Commission Racial Justice Commission, anything that is contained in the charter, which is our constitution.
Right.
One of those challenges, what we've heard in terms of the idea of inequity in the system, has been perversively people who live in the New York City Housing Authority feeling that they're treated differently because they're not addressing the same manner by which others are. And as you said, they feel themselves as taxpayers. So my question was, in part of what you're suggesting here is not contained in the charter. So a recommendation, so a charter amendment wouldn't apply for something like the Euler process that you mentioned as an example of it.
Okay. Okay, so the Euler process, part of the whole process is that people, the community, were totally involved. So one of the things that's happening, right, with this blueprint is that legislation has been made without the input of residents in public housing. It's against the 964, which is the HUD regulation that governs, public housing. And so if it becomes a city agency, how different is that going to be? I think that's a whole totally conversation that
Can I
internally.
just tell you what the argument, and this is not our argument, it was presented by an actual panelist. The distinction being that once you have a city agency, city regulations, city council regulations would then apply. The whole Euler process, which was done after the elimination of the Board of Estimates, was to give and empower the city council to do something with city property and city-owned land or something to that effect.
Right.
As such, right now, NYCHA is not in that category.
Okay, I get
because
it.
it's not owned by the city. So the idea that if it's made into an agency or something that was intriguing to some of us as a condition to try to deal with what would be between 500,000, 700,000 people, if you believe the additional numbers, is that if you make it into a city agency, yes, maybe you lose the $1 billion in show that you get from the federal government, but there's treatment, there's the ability to treat the people in there as, as part of the city and not as a afterthought, and not having to kick the can to the federal government is the idea. And so I'm intrigued to you as a president of a tenant of the association and as a community advocate for years, I've worked for many years arguing over this, whether this would be a viable solution that your organization and others will consider as a potential solution to fix this problem.
I'm not sure. I don't know that it would work. It's something we really, under the charter that we would have to look at, the pros and cons of being, we're an authority, and the authority is developed and it's made by the state legislation. So I would think that to become a city agency, the same process would have to happen. And so that's not something I can really talk about right now, except that this is something that, we're looking at, that we're part of the charter. We are in the city. I understand about the property owned and things like that, but we were formed, the authority was formed by the state, right? By the state legislation. So anything that happens about NYCHA in terms of that has to be done by the state legislation. That much I know. Your question about making it a city agency, I don't know. That's, that would have to be something that we the residents would have to really look at and talk about.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
I want to recognize that we are joined by our chair, Jennifer Jones-Austin, and I think she had a question.
Good evening, everyone, and my apologies that I'm not able to be visible, I may be able to in just a minute. Really appreciate what has been brought forward, the testimony that's been provided, as well as the questioning of our Vice Chair Henry Garrido. As I think about, what was presented and the challenges that exist for us as a commission, I'm also centering on the testimony and just this overall or an underlying interest and concern in making sure that wherever a New York City resident may reside, that that person has a voice in matters that concern the community in which they live. Is that an accurate statement? I'm asking that of the person who testified.
We just want to be treated like citizens.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next person to give testimony, Ms. Tanya Bonner. Ms. Bonner, you can unmute and start your testimony.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening. Can you all hear me first of all? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes, good evening. I would like to first thank the NYC Racial Justice Commission and Chair Jennifer Jones Austin for the opportunity to share my oral testimony today. My name is Tanya Bonner, and I am the chair of the Wahi Inwood Task Force on Noise, which is a community organized and run task force addressing excessive noise pollution in Washington Heights and Inwood in Manhattan. Yes, excessive noise pollution is not only a public health issue, but it's also a racial justice issue. Here is how. Just as with other issues of environmental pollution and justice, excessive noise in our city mostly impacts predominantly minority communities. For example, in June of this year, the news media reported that across all of the 5 boroughs, the zip code of 10032 in Washington Heights had the most illegal fireworks complaints made to 311 between April 1st and June 25th of this year. And 3 of the 5 zip codes with the most complaints of illegal fireworks were in Upper Manhattan. Washington Heights and Inwood, of course, is home to a large minority and immigrant population. Additionally, community activists in Chinatown have voiced concerns about the impact of excessive noise from everything from loud parties, construction noise, and the open streets and open restaurants programs on its sizable elderly resident population. And just as in Chinatown, Washington Heights and Inwood elderly residents and non-English speaking residents found it difficult, if not impossible, to voice their concerns via the city's 311 system that still lacks appropriate ESL support. I personally, as a Black woman, have spent hundreds on hotels and co-working spaces to get appropriate sleep and to work from home on professional projects due to the 24/7 fireworks, dirt bikes zipping around, etc. This only creates more financial racial inequity. Our communities are tired of having our quality of life concerns around excessive noise minimized as not important. I can't count the number of times that I've heard people tell me when I've brought these concerns to our various city agencies or other stakeholders that this is just how your community is. It's as if excessive noise is innately part of our culture. It's very insulting, to say the least. Meanwhile, we've watched more resourced and more white communities receive visits from the mayor and the NYP commissioner for the quality of life concerns on the Upper West Side, or in response to issues in Union Square. We implore this commission to consider establishing some sort of central office and or ombudsman office that can ensure that all of our communities' concerns are fairly and justly heard and addressed, regardless of the racial makeup of the communities seeking such help. Similar to the Office of Nightlife, this office could be a central place to address and hear our concerns and to analyze noise pollution complaints. And it could also be a place where varying city agencies and other elected officials and other stakeholders can create holistic and appropriate solutions that don't force communities of color to only rely on NYPD and 311 to try to address their concerns. We are tired of having our concerns being patronized, and we really hope that this commission will consider establishing something that will make addressing 311 complaints and addressing our quality of life issues around excessive noise pollution more equitable, because this is a racial justice issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call the next person to testify, and if Ms. Bonner, if you can stay on in case other commissioners have questions. The next person to give testimony is Shawana Owens. You may begin. If you could unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hello, great.
Hi, good evening to the panel and everyone attending. My name is Shawana Owens, and one of the issues, well, the panelists actually spoke on one of the issues that I wanted to touch on, and that was noise pollution. But another issue that is the most recent one is the newly launching program for young criminal offenders to be paid $1,000 a month for their participation with good behavior. And so, as I do understand, this is a pilot program going on, but I find that instead of us focusing on the real issues, and that is it's a spiritually led in terms of us not focusing on the real reasons why our young children need to refocus their mind. We have removed obtaining the reverence to God in a lot of our school systems and a lot of our government buildings, and a lot of the things that we put before the Most High God. And so I find that with it not only becoming a problem with a racial injustice, but it's a systemic problem all around, because when we remove God out of the very things that He has created, this is going, and then trying to replace it with other things to tackle the problem, we're going to always find ourselves trying to put a temporary band-aid on things that we literally have to constantly put in prayer around communities, around nations, around countries. And so that is basically what I wanted to share to this panel, because a lot of it is just basically smoking mirrors in terms of how we're going to get along without basically putting the reverence and respect where it belongs. And so I yield my rest of my time, and I thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much. If you can unmute yourself and mute yourself and stick around for a little bit in case the commissioners have questions. The next person to give a testimony is Trevor Smith. If you can unmute and begin your testimony.
Sorry, was it? I cut out there for a second.
Oh, you're ready. You're good to go.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Smith, and I am currently working in philanthropy and a resident of the Lower East Side. I truly believe you cannot spell racial justice without spelling reparations. It's a motto that I try and live by as I do the work that I do every day. We have created many commissions just like this one over the past 100 years, such as the Kerner Commission, or even Bill Clinton's One America initiative. The Kerner Commission found that we were moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Nothing was done to adequately address this finding since the commission was formed. And here we are in 2021, seeing firsthand the effects of structural racism when you look at the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and the racial uprisings of last year. Studies after studies have shown that the cumulative effect of these two unequal societies has resulted in numerous inequities, the worst of which I believe is the rising racial wealth gap. Right now, the average white family has grown their wealth to be 10 times that of the average Black family. The importance of household wealth has become abundantly clear, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, as folks have lost their jobs or medical bills have stacked up. The Center for American Progress found that even if we were to pass progressive economic policies at the federal level, such as baby bonds or eliminating student debt, the wealth gap, specifically the Black-white wealth gap, would still remain stark. Last year, the New York State Assembly passed a bill that would form a commission to study what reparations could look like across the state. This city, the largest city in the world, which the largest city in the country, which has also benefited from the institution of slavery, with as much as 40% of New York City residents owning Black people at its height, including prominent New Yorkers such as John Jay, DeWitt Clinton, and Peter Stuyvesant. With that being said, the city must put some of its weight behind the reparations fight at the federal level. Earlier this year, 11 US mayors made a pledge to pay reparations to a group of Black residents in their cities with the aim of setting an example for the federal government on how a nationwide program could work. I urge this commission to work with the city to explore how to join this effort. I also urge this commission to advocate for the legislature to pass Bill 83080A, which again passed the Assembly, but not the Senate, and also use its voice as the largest and most influential city in the country, and arguably the world behind Washington, D.C., to push for reparations at the federal level to finally close the racial wealth gap and realize the promises that were made during the Reconstruction era, and more importantly, made in the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Now I'd like to open up the commissioners. If you have any questions to those folks who provided testimony, if you can show of hands. How are we? Commissioner Coy, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I have a question for Trevor. How do you have any suggestions in terms of how the reparation will be paid for, or how do we fund that reparation that you just discussed?
Sure. So I believe I'm a proponent of reparations at the federal level, but we have been seeing some local initiatives take place. So, for instance, in Evanston, Illinois, they recently passed they recently legalized marijuana, and they're using some of the income from taxing marijuana to fund their local reparations program. And specifically there in Evanston, it is focused on some of the housing discrimination that took place there. And so they're specifically trying to find those people who were affected by housing discrimination in the city. And I believe the amount they're going to be given is, I want to say like $25,000 to $30,000. I have to fact check that. But at the local level, especially as more and more states, I think, are in New York, recently passed the MRTA, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. I believe that marijuana reform and marijuana justice, I think, is a really good approach to raising revenue to pay for reparations. But again, I do think that at the city and state level, the main goal should be using our voice to recommend reparations at the federal level, and we know that the federal government can raise money in various ways.
As a follow-up, would you be kind of supportive of like maybe something along like maybe having some kind of like real estate flip tax, a small portion of it be contributed to the fund, or some type of stock transaction kind of a fee, which is very, a very small charge of it, or like maybe something along the line of like when the developer asking for extra FAR, in terms of like additional square footage, to be there's a charge for that, some part of that cost, or the value be contributed to this reparation of some sort?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, I think that the city should, start a conversation so that more and more, Black Americans in the city can answer questions like these, because I think it's obviously a very personal topic and personal solution, and so I obviously can't speak for every Black person in New York City or obviously across the country, but I do. So to answer your question, yes, I do think reparations could take various forms. One of which I do think could and should be direct financial compensation, and other ways I believe could also be in the form of, as you said, like housing tax credits or tax credits in general, or land. So yes, I think it could take various forms, but I do think that's something that this commission could even do is could create and commission a survey that asks those kind of questions, and see what the residents, the Black residents of New York City have to say.
Thank you. Chair Jones-Austin?
Thank you, Chair Yu. My question is for Trevor Smith, just continuing the thinking and exchange concerning reparations. So, when I think about reparations, and like you, I look at some of what is happening in counties across the country. I see in some instances restitution. Haven't seen anything centered on compensation just yet. And I've also seen some efforts for example, Virginia, and this may actually be statewide and not just a county, where it seems like they're taking a look at capacity building, beginning to give tuition, cover college costs for descendants of slaves in the state of Virginia. Do you have any thoughts about capacity building as a form of reparations?
Interesting. And so I just dropped into the chat the link that I referenced of the organization when I was giving my testimony, Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity. In terms of capacity building, I mean, I think I'd have to think about it more and maybe even understand what you mean by capacity building. Is it, are you saying like the increasing the capacity? Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I'll give you so I'll just use the Virginia example, where, one might say, well, to descendants of slaves, let's provide restitution to restore them to restore what was taken from them. Let's provide compensation for work that was never fully compensated. Let's decide upon a sum amount, or let's do capacity building. And so covering tuition, paying for college for the descendants of slaves is the way that Virginia looks at it, of building the capacity, the potential going forward. Student in Virginia gets tuition-free education, but as a way of ensuring, because part of the part of the reason that Blacks have a racial wealth gap, and possibly in others, is due to low wages in part, the lack of ability to grow assets, but a lot of that has to do with lower wages, and high student debt. Mm-hmm. And so very often people are not able to go to college without debt, because of lack of resources, lack of wealth. And so Virginia says, let's give tuition-free education. And that's a way of building capacity, education, and opportunity for the descendants of slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And so, yes, I think I would, again, I do think that this work and this effort, as with most policy, has to be driven by those who are most affected. And so in Evanston, mm-hmm. In Evanston, I think more people were in favor of what they did there, which was basically like a housing. I would say it's like a form of housing reparations, where the folks in Evanston can only use what is going to be given to them for a down payment on a house, and it's specifically for housing discrimination. And I know in DC, Georgetown University, they identified the descendants of those who were enslaved that they sold, and they gave them free tuition to come to Georgetown University. And so, yes, I think at the local level, it's probably makes more sense to do things like that, offer free tuition, work with universities such as Columbia University, which, I haven't dove into the history of Columbia University, but I'm sure that they have some, you can look into their endowment and probably make some tie to the institution of slavery or just discrimination that blocked people from attending. And so at the local level, I do think it would make a lot of sense to work with the institutions, particularly the Ivy Leagues like Columbia University that have been around for a long time, to think about what reparations could look like in the educational space or in the housing space, while also at the same time advocating for something at the federal level, because I think that's the only way that we can close the racial wealth gap is at the federal level. But yes, I do think things can and should be done at the local level, working with various institutions. JP Morgan, which is based in New York City, they definitely benefited off of the institution of slavery. And so what can New York City do, working with private companies to make sure that they play their part?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Vice Chair Garrido, you had a question?
Yeah, it's two questions actually for Trevor. The first one is following up on this discussion about, there in some circles, people who have talked about reparations have said that the movement to try to get local municipalities like New York City and states, it gives the federal government an out on something that should be something they should be at the federal level should be done, and that they would like to see nothing more, because then instead of having a national discussion about it, they'll say, well, New York City is wealthy and let them do it locally, and that sort of like leave the responsibility to the federal government, who institutionalized many of those racist policies that we're talking about that led to organizations to benefit from slavery, as you mentioned. Do you think that a local change that would address this issue, that would include some sort of revenue or piece, whether it's from the legalization of marijuana, was Commissioner Cube said, any other force of funding, is a way of giving the federal government out and letting them abrogate their responsibility? First question. And the second question, I'm going to be quite clear, is the idea of the commission is to put recommendations that will go in front of the ballots on November 2022. As a voting public, do you think reparations should be put on the ballot for the general public to decide? Those are my two questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Super great questions. And so, yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and I believe Derek Hamilton is on this commission, right?
Yes, he is.
Commissioner Hamilton is with us.
Yes. So, so you have an expert on the commission who I've learned so much from. I would say he's a mentor of mine. And another mentor of mine is Dr. Sandy Darity. And he's kind of been the biggest proponent of, I guess I would say leading the fight against local reparations. He's said over and over again that if you take all the state budgets combined, that's not even enough to close the racial wealth gap. And so I know that there are kind of diverging opinions on this topic. And I talked to him recently about this in my newsletter, shameless plug. I just put it into the chat. And so I would urge the commission to read kind of his thoughts there. What I would say is that I don't think any conversation around reparations is going to detract from what the federal government could and should do. That is kind of opposing what Dr. Darity says, but I think that the conversation needs to be had, and there are various institutions, both private and public, at the state, local, and federal level that are all culpable of creating this racial wealth gap. And so we've seen, I think, across the country, things that eventually make it and bubble up at the federal level, that make it and topple at the federal level, bubbled up at the state level. And so I think even as marijuana, as we touched on now, I think we're going to get to a point where so many states will have legalized marijuana that the federal government will have to do the same, and also have to look at what harm has been done with federal drug laws and the war on drugs that hopefully can be repaired. And so I do think that the conversation will have to be advanced at the local and state level. And I do hear that some folks will probably say, well, if reparations were done at the local and state level, why should we do it at the federal level? I just think that that's a policy that's going to be a part of the policy fight. And I don't think it should detract us from doing something at the local level. And then to answer your second question, I definitely think that, again, that it should be up to the voters, that a question around reparations, should we develop a commission at the city level or whatever that question might be, I think should be on the ballot, me, one person personally, but also think that a survey could be done before that to determine if that's the case, or whatever, or conversations or focus groups or whatever. But I do think that the conversation needs to be had, and I'd be very interested. And I think that the impact of New York City putting something like that on the ballot would move the needle on racial justice federally or just across the country enormously.
Great, thank you for that. Any other questions for the other panelists? If not, I want to thank the first four of you for offering your testimony. We really appreciate it, and thank you very much. So the next person I have is Hannah A. So Hannah, if you can unmute yourself and start your testimony.
Good evening, commissioners. My name is Hannah Anouche, and I'm a member of the New York City, or of the Abolish the New York City Tax Lien Sale Coalition, and I'm a staff person for the East New York Community Land Trust. So the Abolish the New York City Tax Lien Sale is a group of 10 organizations across New York City fighting to get rid of the tax lien sale. We've held workshops and roundtables to educate communities about the tax lien sale and to build consensus about how to actually reform it. So we've heard from people about the negative impacts of it, and we've actually developed a campaign to get rid of it altogether based on what we've heard from people. And we've held many press conferences and rallies to push the city council and the mayor to end the tax lien sale. And so just a little bit about the tax lien sale. So since 1996, the city has actually outsourced a critical municipal function, which is debt collection, to the detriment of communities of color and to the benefit of Wall Street investors. Through the tax lien sale, the city sells property tax and municipal debt in bulk to an investor-backed trust. And the trust then tacks on high interest and a ton of fees that push people who are already financially distressed and struggling, into further distress. People can go from a small amount of debt to, really extreme amount of debt very quickly due to the tax lien sale, and it can result in foreclosure. And so basically, when property owners in the tax lien sale aren't able to meet this financial burdens, they can lose their home and lose their equity. And what happens is their homes get sold to the highest bidder, to real estate developers and to speculators. So since its inception, since the tax lien sale was created by Giuliani, it's had a really negative and disproportionate impact on communities of color throughout New York City. And it's allowed investors to benefit. And so the Abolish the Tax Lien Sale urges the commission to propose a formal ban on the selling of tax, water, and emergency repair liens to private entities, whether to individuals or to trusts. And the commission can do this through the city charter. So we're asking for an end to the tax lien sale. Better and fair policy can follow and can be introduced at the city level, by the city council or the mayor. But as long as the tax lien sale exists, the city doesn't have an incentive to come up with a truly racially just alternative to the tax lien sale. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next person to testify is Nicole Yearwood. Nicole, if you can unmute yourself and start your testimony.
Hello.
Great, we can hear you. You can start. You may begin.
Thank you. So I just want to say good evening to the commissioners and New Yorkers joining virtually. My name is Nicole Yearwood, and I'm the founder of Educated Voter. On my website, educatedvoter.net, and on social media, I share free voting and civics information and provide civics and government consultant services. For the last 3 years, I've educated communities on the importance of the 2020 census. And this spring, I consulted for Rank the Vote NYC to educate New Yorkers on ranked choice voting ahead of the June 2021 primary. I would like to suggest changes to Chapter 46, which is the chapter on elections and voter assistance of the charter. After quickly reviewing the chapter, I noticed that it did not specifically state who is responsible for informing New Yorkers about changes to the voting process. I think that the charter should clearly outline who is responsible for educating NYC residents on significant changes to voting and provide a clear timeline for that work. There was a lot of confusion around who was responsible for informing New Yorkers about ranked choice voting and when that education should have begun. I'm raising this to the Racial Justice Commission because there were many claims made that the lack of ranked choice voting education will possibly disenfranchise communities of color in New York City. And that concludes my testimony for today.
Thank you very much. The next
You're
person
welcome.
to give testimony is Richard Espinal. Richard, if you can unmute yourself and begin your testimony.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to offer my testimony. Thank you to the work of this commission as well as everyone who has testified so far. And I am going to apologize in advance that my testimony is not as well prepared as some of the former panelists. I do want to touch upon two things that are for me as a parent, as a Bronx resident, that are incredibly important. One is the issue of our school systems and to what extent the charter can dictate the operations of the schools. I am personally unclear, but I am concerned about in two particular areas. One is that we have in some of our schools where parents, where they are more affluent, have a lot more resources, have the ability to bring in additional resources into the school, and their parent associations, they operate better, they have more support by the school administrations, and there needs to be greater equity around the parent associations and their ability to influence policies and in the schools. In many of particularly in our lower income communities, our parents are simply shut out from the process, and they do not have the capacity and the resources to really be influential, to bring, again, things into the school that perks up the ears of principals and administrators. The other piece related to that is I believe every Title I school in the city should be essentially a community school, in that many of our schools are basically fortresses after hours, when they should be opening and running food pantries. They should be open for community use. There should be adult education classes. Our school buildings should be a resources for our entire communities. And the fact that they're basically shut down at 2:20 or 2:30 or 3 o'clock or whenever it is a real shame, and it's a missed opportunity. And so I think that is something that needs to be addressed. Another thing that I'd like to just raise very quickly, and this is directly in the charter, is our community boards. Our community boards need to be restructured in that right now, the current process where the borough president has appointees, the city council member has appointees, that really just creates a situation where everyone's picking their favorites, and particularly when it comes to our city council members. I know we have a diverse city council, but they are not necessarily looking at the diversity of their communities. They're looking at the people who are voting for them. They're looking for the people where they're going to get support. And we know that New York City is a city of blocks. We know that you can have one minority group within a minority community, and those folks get overlooked because they either don't have enough numbers to influence an election, or again, because of language access or any other issues. And so I think our community boards need to have more power. They need to have more of a voice, and they need to be free of the influence of the local elected officials. And in fact, they should probably have more influence and power over the local elected officials so that more community voices can be heard. So thank you very much. And I do want to just conclude with this thought for the entire commission, and it's that understanding that the legacy of Americans of slavery cannot be minimized. I hope this commission also takes into consideration that the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade goes beyond our borders and really the entire Western Hemisphere, and those who came from that legacy from the Caribbean, from Latin America, carry with them not only that legacy of slave trade, but also the fact that they're coming here as immigrants. And that I hope that the commission takes that into consideration in any of the work that it's doing, because I think sometimes that element is lost in that the transatlantic slave trade was just that. It impacted the Western Hemisphere in a way that, and again, not trying to minimize the legacy of slavery in this country, but many people carry that from their home countries here, and so they're hit with multiple layers of oppression and inequity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up to the commissioners to ask any questions. Vice Chair Garrido.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Hannah. In your testimony, you talked about the lien sale being an expression here in the city where inequitable distribution and sales of community colors are disproportionately affected. Can you give us an example of how that would happen? Because the presumption is if you don't pay your taxes, you don't pay your taxes. They're doing a lien. This lien, it's affecting every community in the same manner. Well, we're looking at the commission of things that are affecting inequitable distribution. Can you give us an example of how this affects communities of color and a proportionally larger effect than others?
Sure. Well, I mean, the reality is the data shows that the tax lien sale disproportionately affects particular communities of color throughout New York City. And, the data is very stark. We can share maps and that kind of thing that show that there's a significantly higher number of tax lien sale properties in specific communities of color. So the effect of that is that there's a concentration of distressed properties, and that can destabilize a whole community, because many of these properties will end up either the property owner will decide to sell because they're like, oh my God, my home is going to be sold, or my debt is being sold to a tax lien sale, to a tax lien trust, let me sell, or they'll actually get foreclosed on. So this concentration in specific neighborhoods has a really destabilizing impact. In addition to that, though, often it's homeowners who've dealt with, racial housing policy, like, dating back to redlining, being unable to get home repair loans. And then what happens is, people can't get the repairs done in their homes. They end up with emergency repair debt, or they end up with water bill debt because there's a leak in their home and they weren't able to get the repair loan. So you see all of these impacts kind of building on one another, and I think that's why that's one of the reasons why the tax lien sale disproportionately affects communities of color.
Can I push out a little bit on that, if you don't mind, Hannah?
Sure.
Is this part of, what we saw in the housing balloon crisis, where communities were targeted for more predatory lending practices across the board? Do you think that's resulting also in a lot of these lien sales in the process now?
Yeah, exactly. Communities are targeted by predatory lending. They've gotten, they've been preyed on by loan sharks, and so they're already victims of, they're already dealing with financial hardship due to that, and then on top of that, to have the lien sale.
And who does the lien sale on the outsourced portion that you mentioned before on behalf of the city?
So it's a private trust that currently is administered by the Bank of New York Mellon, and there's very little transparency around the trust. But basically, the trust is made up of Wall Street investors, hedge funds, and developers. And we're actually part of a task force that the city created due to our advocacy that's supposed to look at the lien sale. But so far, we've still gotten very, very little information from the city about actually how this trust works. And I think it's largely due to the fact that the city doesn't even know.
Thank you. And Ms. Yearwood, you went a little too fast when you mentioned the part of the charter that you wanted us to look. Can you repeat that, please?
Yes, absolutely. It's chapter 46, elections and voter assistance. And that's where they outline the campaign finance board and the voter assistance piece, but there's no real talk of, for instance, NYC Votes is through the campaign finance board, and they currently, they educate New Yorkers about voting, etc. But they're not, it's not really clearly stated who is responsible for educating New Yorkers about significant changes to the voting process. And there is no timeline. So for instance, ranked choice voting was voted on in 2019. And, fast forward, we had the pandemic through 2020. Then we got to the end of the end of 2020, and people approached the Board of Elections. They approached other entities asking about education around ranked choice voting. And, it wasn't really clear who was responsible for educating people about it. NYC Vote said that they would do the education, but they were going to do it starting in January of this year. And a lot of people felt like it wasn't enough time to adequately educate New Yorkers. So I was suggesting that when a change takes place, that there should be a sort of timeline, and it should clearly say who is responsible for informing New Yorkers about changes to the voting and elections process.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony, all three of you.
You're welcome.
Chair Jones-Austin.
Hi, my question is for Richard Espinal. When you spoke about inequitable funding in education, and you spoke specifically about the added resources that come from the community into the schools, speaking specifically about I guess, more affluent communities. And let me just say to you, I appreciate your doing so because you're so spot on. We've seen here in New York City where in more affluent communities, they raise, one year I saw one school, not the school district, but one school raised $750,000 that they were then able to put into the hiring the paraprofessionals, after school teachers for robotics and Mandarin and the like. But then in a community just literally blocks away, the PTA raised about $300 for the year. And that sets up inequity, just in the classroom experience beyond. Do you have any thoughts? And I'm not punting this to you, I'm just curious because you've looked at this. Do you have any thoughts about how we should look at discretionary dollars that are applied either by the city or by individuals in the community to the schools? Like what do you think should be, let me put it this way, you may not know the charter, you may, but what do you think should be allowed and what should not be allowed?
So I think that, and thank you for the question. First of all, I don't think any parent association should have the ability to raise funds to hire anyone in the school system. I think that's just, it creates a problem for the staff who get hired, whose positions are funded in this way. But I think that, there should be some more general oversight and perhaps even some fund sharing where, maybe there needs to be some money going into the community pot, if you will, so that there can be a little bit more equity in terms of basic resources. And I'll give you an example. As I mentioned, I'm in the Bronx. I was a PTA president for many years. And, we did okay, I think, as a PTA. We raised some years around $10,000, which, I give myself a pat on the back for that. But the school right up the hill was able to raise, maybe 6-7 times that much and was able to provide free after school for all of their students. I mean, so, when you are dealing with that kind of inequity where you have free after school and you have grants to teachers and you're doing, all these kinds of activities, and yet street down the hill, the poorer parents have to figure out how to come out of pocket to pay for after school programs, and the teachers are all scrounging, begging parents to, raid Staples for school supplies and all those kinds of things. There's a problem, and it just perpetuates year after year after year. And I don't necessarily have the solution, but I do think that there has to be some more oversight in terms of what PTAs and other ways that parents can get involved and raise monies. But the other side of that is just from a capacity perspective, is that you have a lot of in these schools that, again, lower income communities of color, where the parents just are not equipped from a leadership perspective, either because they don't have the time, they themselves are dealing with a legacy, right? They're not necessarily coming into this, with the right background or with any kind of training, and yet they're giving their all. They're giving their hearts, they're giving their time, but they don't necessarily have the same background and the connections that, again, another group from another school is going to have.
Thank you. Commissioner
Thank you.
Faber?
Thanks so much.
Thank you to everyone who's had a chance to speak thus far. It's been really enlightening and it's very much appreciated. My question is for Ms. Nicole Yearwood. Ms. Yearwood, we've heard a variety of community members suggest that perhaps we should consider the possibility of racial justice impact statements in order to ferret out the impact of suggested policy changes, initiatives, so on and so forth, and to really understand how the proposed policy or initiative might impact communities of color. As I think back to the challenges that we experienced in the ranked choice voting era, which, as you rightly pointed out, was something that was voted into effect in 2019, and yet there was this seemingly inability to determine who was actually responsible for ensuring that communities across the city were actually going to be properly educated about ranked choice voting. What are your thoughts on the possibility of mandating racial justice impact statements on policy changes, initiatives that are introduced, perhaps definitely with a forward-looking view, but perhaps even a racial justice impact statement that also has its ability to look back on changes that have already been implemented as a way of monitoring how these policies and initiatives are actually playing out on the ground. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, just off the top of my head, again, just kind of hearing it, and thank you for the question. I mean, I think it is a good idea to look at it. As I was doing the education, myself, and I talked about my background, but, I used my experience in politics and government affairs to kind of fuel my civics education work. And what was clear to me, and I don't think was clear to most, is that communities of color have a different way of approaching voting. And so, while others may have, and I think this was something that even Richard kind of, touched on, is having the luxury of time to research candidates. When we have people, who have told me, listen, I don't have time to pay attention, to politics and government and voting and things like that, because I'm trying to make ends meet, that that's something that is real for communities of color. And so sometimes when I have a conversation with other entities, they have, with other groups, they have the luxury of time. They will sit, they will research their candidates and have that ability to actually rank based on policy, where I find that in communities of color, and this goes across, socioeconomic lines, we may not come out to vote because we don't like any of the candidates, whereas others see the difference. They take the personality out and they look just specifically at policy implications. And so that is something that, I think that the Racial Justice Commission could maybe, tease out and talk about those kinds of impacts and just the different ways that we may approach the same thing. On its face, it's definitely a great idea to give people more options. But if we're not coming out to vote because we don't, quote unquote, like one person, how is it that then we will get to ranking 5? And you don't without looking at policy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. To our staff, do we have any more testimony ready to go, or should we take a little break? 5 minutes?
We have put out a call in the chat if anyone else is interested in testifying. So let's just give it 1 minute for folks to respond if they are interested. And if there is not anyone else who's interested in testifying, then we can close the session.
Great. Well, I see. Oh, we have 2 folks. The next person to testify, Deneen Ferguson. If you can unmute yourself and start your testimony.
Oh, okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good evening. My name is Deneen Ferguson, and I am representing the community of the Rockaways, Far Rockaway, Auburn. I am the co-chair of the Queens Recovery and Resiliency Committee with the Far Rockaway Auburn Nonprofit Coalition. And I got a list of issues, but for the priority right now is around the city's policies with the way in which the pandemic was handled or is being handled for the Rockaways, as being, I think, the second or third hardest hit community zip code wise in the state of New York. And some of that is around, I think 1169, 11692 represent maybe 80% Black and Hispanic residents. And we would like to see the city, we've mentioned this in meetings with the Test and Trace Community Advisory Board that we're part of. And there are several other groups that represent community organizations active during disaster that are part of those discussions, that the city is, while they have what's called an equity committee, equity initiative, office, agency, they're not really addressing the folk that are local in our communities, whether it's Staten Island, whether it's the Harlem Coad, the Rockaways, Brooklyn Coads, directly allowing us to help our people or motivate our people towards getting vaccinated for the virus, the right now the COVID virus, or the variant now that's coming. There are several things that were done in the Rockaways that were prohibitive. There's a message that's being sent that there's hesitancy around vaccination. So that's true, but that message is being amplified, I think, in a facetious manner, because in reality, I like to try to term it this way: if there was a hostage situation happening at Walmart and people were being held, the helicopters would come, the SWAT teams would come, they would be surrounding the place to deliver those people from that hostage situation. When the pandemic was raging and bodies were being placed in trailers behind the St. John's Hospital, and then a vaccine came out, it was the most prohibitive thing in the world was to be able to get access to that vaccine. Had the access been provided in such a manner like the response of a hostage situation, then I think there would have been a lot less hesitancy, a lot more folk in our communities more willing to get vaccinated. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that happened that should not have happened. So the Frank organization, or the Frank Coalition, was made an authorized scheduler with the Department of Health, Mental Health. An authorized scheduler had authority to make scheduled appointments only for seniors age 65 and above. So when we began, and this is a no-cost contract, we were not paid to make these appointments or to assist the city in making these appointments. When we were making the appointments, we were only allowed to send the Rockaway residents to Aviation High School for their vaccines. Just for those that might not be familiar with the geography of the state, Rockaway is the southernmost tip you can go without being in the Atlantic Ocean. Aviation High School is like traveling up to the North Pole for someone coming from Rockaway, especially a senior, a person age 65 and above. When I made noise about that, they're like, okay, Ms. Ferguson, now we have appointments in Canarsie. So now you want me to have these seniors 65 and above travel to a different borough. And then after making noise more again, now, Mrs. Ferguson, we have appointments at Beach Channel High School. Great, but the appointments are available at 7 or 8 p.m. So I would say to that, when grandma's putting on her jammies, getting ready to watch her favorite show, you want her to go out and seek a vaccine, like it's getting dark outside. So there are a lot of things.
Ms. Ferguson, I don't mean to interrupt, but you've hit your 3-minute mark. So I'm gonna ask you to wrap up and get to your point, and we'll give you additional 30 seconds to make your point.
Okay, thank you. We just would like to see the city be more responsive to the local community-based organizations that are hyper local, already in the community, serving the community prior to COVID, and have a more authentic partnership and relationship with those organizations, our organizations, in setting their policies and rolling out services to meet the needs, the health needs and other needs of our Black and Brown population. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind the other folks waiting to testify that we have a 3-minute mark. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, we'll hear an alarm to let you know that you have a few minutes left to wrap up. And so you might have missed the instructions if you didn't join us at the beginning of the session, but I just wanted to update and refresh everybody's memory. The next person to testify is Darren Mack. Darren, if you can unmute yourself and begin your testimony.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Commissioner, for the opportunity to give my testimony. My name is Darren Mack. I'm with Freedom Agenda, which is a member-led organization dedicated to organizing people, communities impacted by incarceration to achieve decarceration and system transformation. I like to bring some attention to one of the least transparent agencies in our city that has caused so much harm on Black and Brown people, and that is the Department of Corrections. So from 2012 to 2020, like the average daily jail population in New York City fell 52%, but the Department of Corrections operating budget grew by 24%. No, we are spending the most money on DOC, but getting the worst results, and lives are being lost. You know, for several years now, there has been a federal monitor overseeing the citywide jail system, and things are getting worse. So I encourage this commission to recommend one, a gradual reining in and reallocation of DOC's budget gradually, and be right-sizing the system and transition the jail staff into other city jobs. So like there's no other local jail system that costs as much as New York City. Los Angeles, which has a jail population 3 times as large as New York, but their budget is at least 1 billion less than New York's. You know, every other jail system in the country operates with a $500 million or less. New York City is over $2 billion annually. So I think we need to rein in and reallocate DOC's budget into communities that's been impacted by incarceration. You know, those communities have already been identified in a study conducted by incarcerated men, who found that over 75% of New York State's prison population came from 7 New York City neighborhoods, like Harlem, like the South Bronx, like Bronzeville. We need to be reallocating resources from DOC back into these communities. And the challenge here is that DOC spends 86% of their budget on staff and wages and benefits. And less than 5% of the budget is on things like program and nutrition, you know, other services. So that's what I propose, that we rein in this budget and reallocate those resources back into impacted communities. Thank you. I don't have any questions about that. And finally, I just want to conclude by saying this was already done in LA in an amendment called Measure J. It was done last year, actually.
Great. If you can just hang on in case the commissioners have questions. Thank you for your testimony. The next person to testify is Deborah Ack. Deborah, if you can unmute yourself and start your testimony.
Good evening. I believe I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hi, good evening, Commission. First, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to give my testimony. Again, my name is Deborah Ack, and I am a member of the East New York Community Land Trust, better known as the East New York CLT. And I am also a member of the Abolish the New York City Tax Lien Sale Coalition. I'm not going to go so much into what the coalition is, because you heard from my colleague Hannah Anousheh who gave her testimony and told you exactly what the Abolish the Tax Lien Sale Coalition is all about. What I am going to talk to you about is why the tax lien sale is a racial injustice issue. Around the city, but especially in communities of color, small homeowners are struggling to pay their municipal bills, and tenants are struggling with bad conditions and absentee landlords. Meanwhile, empty lots sit vacant as speculators flip them for profits without building a thing on them. Instead of designing a system to fix these problems, for the past 25 years, the city has consolidated the liens for property and utility bill debt and sold them to a trust made up of Wall Street investors and hedge funds, relieving the city of its responsibilities to collect on the debt. Low-income renters and homeowners, seniors, and communities of color have suffered as a result. The Abolish the New York City Tax Lien Sale Coalition urges the Racial Justice Commission to propose a formal ban on selling tax, water, or emergency repair liens to private entities, whether individuals or trusts. I would like to say, let's get CLTs more involved in preserving these homes for our community and stop the displacement and gentrification of our Black, Brown, and Latino neighborhoods. Thank you for allowing me my testimony.
Thank you so much. We will pause here and ask the commissioners if they have any questions for our last three panelists. If not, we can move on. Thank you so much. And I just want to share with those of you who are joining us, if you would like to submit testimony, you don't want to do it today, submitting a verbal testimony, but you'd like to submit a written testimony, there's going to be instructions in the chat below. If you can, we'd love to hear from you. This is your opportunity to tell us what you think we need to focus on. So please don't hesitate to tell us your thoughts, share your good ideas. We are interested in everything that you're saying, and all of us are taking copious notes. So I think we will I'm asking staff if you can drop into the chat box where New Yorkers can submit testimony, and then great, thank you. Anusha, here, great, Anusha just put in the box where you can submit your written testimony. Rachel, is there anybody else waiting to testify?
Nope, that's it for this evening. Thank you.
And for those of us that are joining on the YouTube, you can find the place to submit written testimony online by visiting nyc.gov/racial justice and clicking on the public engagement tab. You'll find the link there. You can also visit bit.ly/nyc-4-racial justice, which is what we shared in the chat.
Great. So I'm going to ask Commissioner. Staff reminded me, final call to have anybody share their oral testimony with us today. Going once, going twice, and if not, then I'm going to ask Commissioner Mata to close us out.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. As a community organizer myself, I was very happy to see various community organizers from across New York City join us tonight, because as we know, it is you all that ensures that the city of New York continues playing fair with our community and continues working with our community. So I really want to emphasize that I'm very happy to see many of the community organizers that I've also had the pleasure to work with. Your testimony is incredibly important to this process. It is on public record. We have taken notes, and this will help us shape our recommendations. If we did not get to you, if you are unable to testify today, there will be other opportunities to testify at one of our commission's subsequent sessions, whether virtually or in person. So please stay tuned. You may also submit your testimony online by visiting our website. Our website is nyz.gov/racial justice. Our next virtual session will be this Thursday, August 26th at 5 p.m. This will be a special session where we would like to hear from you about what values and principles should guide the city at its core, for you to tell us what you believe is at the core of the city and makes us uniquely New York City. So make sure to register to attend. We will also be having another in-person public input session that is open to all New Yorkers on September 9th. Stay tuned for those details. And in the meantime, sign up to receive email updates at nyc.gov/racial justice. And lastly, please follow us on social media, Facebook, and to stay tuned at all the events that we have coming up. And our social media, Instagram and Facebook is at Racial Justice NYC, and our Twitter handle is at Racial Justice NYC. So thank you for joining us today. You all said important things and you had an important input. And I would like to thank my fellow commissioners for also joining us and ensuring that we continue listening to the community. Have a good evening, everyone.